There is a kind of silence no one speaks about. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of holding in what would destroy everything if it got out. You carry it, don't you? That strange ache in your chest that tightens when you're alone. That tension in your jaw when someone asks if you're okay. That flicker of rage you feel when someone mistakes your calm for contentment. You carry it like it's yours to bear. But it isn't yours. Not fully. It was forged somewhere back there. In the disappointment that was never acknowledged. In the expectations that crushed your voice before it ever became words. In the moments you betrayed yourself just to be accepted, chosen, seen. That is the war. And the tragedy is that we think it's over once we leave the battlefield of others. But the battlefield only moved inward. Now it's in your head, in your breath, in your sleep, in the way you criticize yourself before anyone else gets the chance, in the way you can't rest unless you're productive, in the way you can't feel worthy unless you're wanted. Carl Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." But what he didn't say outright, what we often miss, is that the unconscious is not some distant abstract realm. It is right here. It is the reason your heart races when there's no danger. The reason you sabotage your own joy. The reason your dreams sometimes feel more honest than your waking life. The unconscious is a war zone of rejected selves. And if you've never stopped to listen to them, they don't disappear, they evolve. They become patterns, personas, reactions, addictions. They become you. You weren't born at war with yourself. That came later, bit by bit. With every moment you were taught that parts of you had to die for love to survive. And so you buried your anger. You hid your ambition. You silenced your intuition. You smiled when you wanted to scream. You gave when you were empty. You adapted. Because adaptation was survival. But the price of survival was your inner wholeness. And now here you are, surviving a life that doesn't feel like your own. Somewhere inside there's still that quiet knowing. That faint memory of who you were before the world told you who to be. You sense it when you're still, when you're not performing, when you're not explaining yourself. It comes in flashes like dreams that evaporate too quickly to grasp. A softness that doesn't need to prove anything. A wildness that doesn't fear being alone. That part of you never died. It simply went underground. And now it waits, watching, wanting to be remembered. But there's a reason we don't go looking. Because to face the war within is to destroy the fragile identity we built on the ruins of what we buried. It is to realize that much of who we think we are is a mask worn so convincingly we forgot it wasn't skin. It is to confront the devastating truth that we abandoned ourselves first. Not out of malice, but out of necessity. The child becomes what the environment demands. And the war begins when the adult starts to hear the cries of the parts that never grew up. This is not something you can heal with mantras, not something a productivity hack can solve. This is existential. This is psychological. This is spiritual. You feel it in the way you crave love that repeats your wounds, in the way your success feels empty, in the way you overextend yourself and then resent everyone for it. You are not broken, but you are divided. And the longer you avoid the war within, the more it defines you from the shadows. Because what you don't make peace with will find a way to speak. Through your body. Through your patterns. Through the collapse you can't explain. At first the war is subtle. Fatigue, irritability, overthinking. but then it deepens. You lose your appetite for life. You feel disconnected not just from others, but from yourself. You numb what you cannot name. You chase distractions to avoid the mirror. And one day you realize the war didn't just shape you, it became you. And that's when something shifts. The ache becomes a question, a quiet pull back to your center, back to the room where you locked away the parts of you you couldn't afford to love. The shame, the grief, the wildness, the need. That's when you stop running. That's when the healing doesn't look like light, but like descent. Not transcendence, but confrontation. And it is terrifying. Because everything in you wants to protect the identity you've worked so hard to uphold. But your deeper self doesn't want perfection. It wants presence. It wants you to come home. And home is not a place. It is not a performance. It is the moment you stop betraying yourself in the name of peace. It is when you hold the pain without explanation. It is when you sit with the ghosts and let them speak. It is when you remember that silence doesn't mean healing, sometimes it means suppression. And the war within cannot be ended by pretending it isn't there. It must be witnessed, not just analyzed, felt, not just understood, held, not just survived, transformed. Most people spend their lives managing the symptoms of an internal war they refuse to name. They call it anxiety, but it's really self-abandonment. They call it burnout, but it's the exhaustion of performing a version of themselves they no longer believe in. They call it loneliness, but it's actually the grief of being disconnected from the parts of themselves they were never allowed to love. We've been taught to fear our own depth, to stay on the surface, to keep swimming so we don't drown. But what if the drowning is exactly what's required? What if healing begins when you finally let go of who you were taught to be and sink into who you actually are? Nietzsche once said, "One must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star." The chaos is not your enemy. It is your truth erupting through the cracks in your carefully curated image. It is the unmet longing, the disowned fury, the sacred despair. You cannot transcend what you have not yet faced. You cannot integrate what you still avoid. And so the chaos grows. It shows up in your relationships, in the way you demand love, but secretly believe you don't deserve it. In the way you say yes when everything in you is screaming no. In the way you play small to be accepted. In the way you self-sabotage when joy feels too unfamiliar to trust. These are not random behaviors. They are the voices of your unlived life speaking in the only language you've allowed them. And yet most people are more afraid of meeting themselves than they are of suffering. Because suffering is familiar. Identity built on pain becomes sacred. You start to protect your wound like it's your child. You cling to the narrative of what was done to you, because without it, who are you? If you're not the victim, if you're not the caretaker, if you're not the achiever, if you're not the one who has it all together, then what remains? That question terrifies the ego, but the soul is waiting for it. You see, the war within you has a function. It is the call to wholeness disguised as chaos. It is not trying to destroy you, it is trying to awaken you. But awakening is not gentle. It is not poetic. It is brutal. It tears away everything false. It dissolves your pride. It humiliates the persona. It breaks your heart not to punish you, but to show you where you have hardened, because that's where the softness needs to return. That's where your humanity lives, not in your perfection, but in your fracture. This war you feel between who you are and who you pretend to be is the friction of transformation. It is the death of the false self. And it is not a metaphor. It is psychological. Your nervous system reacts. Your body holds the score. Your dreams become more vivid. Your rage starts to surface. You begin to cry in moments you can't explain. You withdraw from people who once felt safe. You feel raw, vulnerable, exposed. But for the first time, it's not depression, it's dissent. You are not shutting down, you are opening. And that distinction is everything. Alfred Adler believed that every psychological symptom was a solution, a way to navigate an unresolved problem from early life. What if your inner war is not a flaw, but a solution that's outlived its usefulness? What if the shame was once protection? What if the self-criticism was once a way to control chaos? What if the overthinking was once how you avoided abandonment? You did what you had to. You built defense mechanisms so well they became indistinguishable from your personality. But the war begins when the soul whispers, it's time to evolve. And that's where the courage is required, not the loud performative courage, but the silent kind. The courage to feel what you've buried, to admit what you've denied, to forgive yourself for the years spent dissociated, unaware asleep, to stand in the ruins of your false self and choose something real, something slower, something softer, something terrifyingly honest. Because here's the truth, no one wants to admit a real healing costs you everything that isn't real. Your roles, your masks, your coping, your illusions. You lose people. You lose identities. You lose the comfort of blaming others. And it feels like dying. But it's not. It's a return to the self before the world interfered, to the voice before it was silenced, to the body before it was shamed. You don't become someone new, you reclaim who you always were. But not all of you wants to be free. There are parts that still believe the war is necessary, that peace is dangerous, that love is conditional. These parts don't need to be destroyed. They need to be met, gently, without judgment, because they are not your enemy. They are your younger self frozen in time, still waiting for the safety that never came. And the moment you stop fighting them, the war begins to shift. What was once an inner battlefield becomes a dialogue. And that dialogue becomes integration. And that integration becomes wholeness. But only if you're willing to sit with what's hard. Only if you're willing to feel before you understand. To surrender before you control. That's where the real work lives, not in fixing yourself, but in unlearning who you were never meant to be. There comes a moment, usually in the stillness of isolation, when the old story no longer fits. When pretending feels heavier than being lost. When you realize that the real conflict was never with the world, but with yourself. You sit there maybe at 2 a.m., maybe after another fight, maybe after another silence that said more than words ever could, and something collapses, not dramatically, quietly, like a whisper that undoes everything. And in that moment, you don't want advice. You don't want answers. You want truth, even if it hurts, especially if it hurts, because you're tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep can fix. The kind of tired that comes from constantly living in contradiction, from smiling when you want to disappear, from giving when your own cup is bone dry, from surviving in environments that deny your truth and then punish you for speaking it. That's the war of self-erasure, and eventually something in you says no more. Not out of rage, but out of reverence. A sacred no. A final refusal to keep betraying yourself just to belong somewhere that requires your silence. But that's where it gets harder, not easier. Because when you stop pretending, you stop being rewarded. People who are comfortable with your compliance will begin to resist your truth. They'll say you've changed, that you're being selfish, that you're too intense, too emotional, too much. And every part of your old self will want to apologize, to retreat, to go back to the prison you once called peace. But if you do, the war intensifies, not outside, inside. That's the great paradox. The more you deny your truth to keep the peace, the more violent the internal conflict becomes. This is where Jung's concept of the shadow comes alive. He said, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, because to do so means facing everything you've rejected. The anger, the envy, the need, the guilt, the hunger for love, the desperation for control, the craving for significance. All of it. The parts you were taught to condemn. But those parts, they don't disappear. They hide. And in hiding, they grow bitter, loud, reckless. They leak out in ways that sabotage your relationships, your joy, your inner peace. The only way to disarm them is to meet them without shame. To say, I see you. You make sense. Let's talk. That's what healing really is. Not a return to purity, but a reunion with your complexity. A recognition that nothing within you is inherently wrong. It's only misdirected, unintegrated, unloved. The rage you suppress might be the boundary you never learned to set. The sadness you ignore might be the mourning of a self you were never allowed to be. The resistance you feel might be the part of you that finally refuses to perform. You were never meant to be divided against yourself. And yet, society rewards the well-behaved, not the well-integrated. This is why so many people unconsciously cling to suffering. Because suffering is familiar. It gives identity. It gives structure. To walk away from it is to step into the unknown, to say I don't know who I am without this war. But that's the threshold, the terrifying, liberating threshold between a false life and an authentic one. And not everyone crosses it. Some stay, not because they're weak, but because the war, for all its destruction, is still more comfortable than peace they've never tasted. But if you choose to cross, it begins slowly, not with grand declarations, but with quiet choices. You begin saying no to what exhausts your soul. You begin honoring your rhythms. You begin grieving without rushing the process. You begin speaking even when your voice trembles. You begin disappointing others rather than betraying yourself. You begin recognizing that the war within doesn't end in victory, it ends in surrender. Not to defeat, but to truth. To the quiet, undeniable truth of who you really are. And then something remarkable happens. You stop needing permission. You stop outsourcing your worth. You stop confusing love with control. You begin to feel at home in your own body, in your own mind, in your own presence. The internal chaos softens not because it's gone, but because it's finally been seen. You stop trying to fix yourself like a broken machine. You start listening like you would to a wounded child. And the war within, once fueled by neglect, begins to dissolve in compassion. That is how you become whole, not by becoming better, but by becoming real, by integrating what was once split, by loving what was once feared, by reclaiming what was once lost. The self you were always meant to be was never gone. It was buried beneath the noise, beneath the shame, beneath the roles you were assigned. And now as you return, you do so slowly, tenderly, with reverence, because you understand now the war was not the enemy. It was the signal, the fire, the call. And it led you here, to the edge of your old identity, to the brink of your awakening. Not a loud, dramatic awakening, but a quiet one. One that whispers you are no longer at war. You are finally coming home. There is something sacred about the moment you realize you don't have to fight yourself anymore. It doesn't come with fanfare. No one applauds. The world doesn't change. But you do. Subtly, profoundly. You stop waiting for someone else to save you. You stop performing for a love that never felt safe. You stop trying to outwork your pain or outrun your past. You begin to see the war for what it was, not proof of your brokenness, but proof of your aliveness. A desperate, wounded, beautiful attempt to protect yourself with the only tools you had. This is where the reckoning begins. You realize how much time you've lost defending a self you never fully believed in. You feel the weight of years spent explaining yourself to people who were never listening. You feel the hollowness of achievements earned from a place of fear. And you grieve, not because you failed, but because you see now how deeply you abandoned yourself in order to survive. And yet there is grace even in this, because now you can choose differently. You no longer need to prove your worth by suffering. You no longer need to apologize for your truth. You no longer need to fight battles that don't belong to you. The war within only becomes who you are when you identify with the wounds rather than the wisdom beneath them. When you mistake survival patterns for personality. When you build a life around avoidance and call it discipline. But you are not here to live small, to die quietly inside while smiling on the outside. You are here to remember, to reclaim, to reawaken. Schopenhauer once said that compassion is the basis of morality, but before it can be extended outward, it must begin within. You cannot offer the world a love you deny yourself. You cannot hold space for others if you've exiled parts of your own soul. The integration begins when you turn inward not as a critic, but as a companion. When you walk into the abandoned places of your psyche and simply say, I'm here now. I see you. I'm not running anymore. This is not glamorous work. It won't go viral. It won't always feel profound. Sometimes healing is messy. Sometimes it's numb. Sometimes it feels like regression, like you're back in a place you swore you left. But healing is not linear. It spirals. It deepens. And the deeper it goes, the more you confront the roots of your identity, where the war first began. Often it started in love, or what you thought was love. In the places where your needs were too loud, where your sensitivity was punished, where your emotions were dismissed. You internalized it. You made it your fault. And so began the war between the part of you that needed to be loved and the part of you that learned to suppress that need. But love that costs your authenticity is not love, it's compliance. And compliance is not peace, it's quiet suffering. The war within thrives in silence. It feeds on your unwillingness to speak your truth. But when you find the courage to name what you feel, to sit with what hurts, to ask for what you need without shame, that is when the tide turns. That is when the war begins to lose its power. Not all of it will go. Some of it will remain. There are scars that stay reminders of the battles fought. But they no longer define you. They no longer control you. They become part of your story, not your identity. You carry them with grace, not guilt. With honesty, not bitterness. And from this place, you begin to live, not from the wound, but from the wisdom it gave you. Because what remains, if nothing changes, a life built on performance. A soul split in half. A heart that beats but never feels. That is the cost of denying the truth. You lose yourself, slowly, quietly, until one day you look in the mirror and no longer recognize the eyes staring back. That's when you know the war didn't just become you, it erased you. But if you listen, if you allow the silence to speak, if you stop running, if you sit with the discomfort, if you hold yourself through the breaking, if you choose truth over image, honesty over comfort, presence over performance, then the war becomes something else. It becomes a path, a ritual, a rite of return to a self that was never lost, only hidden. And that's where this ends. Not with a conclusion, but with a choice. To carry the war forward, or to lay down the sword, to keep managing the symptoms, or to finally face the source. To survive on the edge of yourself, or to descend into your depth and come back whole. Because wholeness isn't perfection. It's not the absence of conflict. It's the presence of inner alignment. The quiet knowing that you are no longer divided, that you don't need to become anything. You only need to remember. The war within becomes you only if you forget who you are. But you. There is a kind of silence no one speaks about. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of holding in what would destroy everything if it got out. You carry it, don't you? That strange ache in your chest that tightens when you're alone. That tension in your jaw when someone asks if you're okay. The person who cannot see themselves. There is a strange kind of suffering that no one talks about. It's not loud. It doesn't scream. It walks quietly beside you, sits across from you at dinner, lays down with you at night. It is the ache of being unknown to yourself, of waking up inside a life that fits the version of you that others have sculpted, but never quite touches the truth that lives just beneath your skin. You sense it when you hear your own voice and don't recognize it. You feel it when you laugh at something that doesn't amuse you, agree with something that doesn't resonate, stay where you no longer belong. There's a hollowness to it, a quiet, persistent feeling that you are not quite in your life, only acting it out. You may think you know yourself. You can recite your habits, your favorite foods, the roles you play, the names others call you. But knowing of yourself is not the same as seeing yourself. Seeing is brutal. Seeing is not flattery. Seeing is confrontation. It is the collapse of illusion. And that's why most people avoid it. Because to truly see yourself means to dismantle the identity you've spent your whole life constructing to survive. It means facing the truth that you've built a personality not out of freedom, but out of fear. And fear is a masterful architect. It molds you with precision, with silence, with shame. Carl Jung wrote, "The most difficult thing is to penetrate the darkness of the unconscious and to uncover the secret motivations of our actions." The person who cannot see themselves is not blind by accident. They are blind by design. It begins in childhood when the truth of who you were was too loud, too wild, too inconvenient. You were trained by parents, peers, culture to disown the parts of yourself that disrupted the harmony of the environment. So you adapted. You became what was rewarded. You killed what was rejected. And in doing so, you started to vanish. This is the tragedy of the false self. It is functional, praised, even admired. But it is not real. It is a mask fused to the face. And over time, you forget where the mask ends and the skin begins. You perform the life you think you're supposed to want. You chase the dreams handed to you by others. You mimic feelings instead of experiencing them. And yet, late at night, or when you're alone in nature, or when you're caught off guard by silence, you feel it. The strange sense that something essential is missing. Not from the world, from you. To be unable to see yourself is not a failure of intelligence. It is a form of psychological self-preservation. The unconscious mind protects you from what it believes would destroy you. It hides your truth behind projections. It distracts you with ambition. It clouds your vision with ego. Nietzsche once said, "Every profound spirit needs a mask." But the danger is when the mask becomes a mirror and you start mistaking the reflection for the self. And so you create stories. You tell yourself that you're fine, that you're content, that the emptiness is normal, that everyone feels this way. You bury the questions that threaten your equilibrium. Why do I feel disconnected when nothing is wrong? Why do I sabotage love when it feels real? Why do I keep performing when I don't believe in the script? These are the whispers of the unseen self. The parts of you waiting in the shadows, hoping to be remembered. They don't demand, they mourn. This blindness is not passive. It is an active resistance to your own depth. Because depth requires descent, and descent requires courage. You have to go where it hurts. You have to unlearn what you were praised for. You have to confront your own betrayal, not the betrayal done to you, but the betrayal by you, of you. And that is the hardest thing to admit, that you were the one who left yourself first. And yet the symptoms remain. Chronic dissatisfaction, numbness, compulsion, a gnawing sense of fraudulence. These are not problems to fix. They are messages, clues, signals from the unconscious that something vital has been lost. You may look successful. You may seem stable. But you can feel the dissonance. The life you're living was built by someone who didn't fully know who they were. And now every step forward feels like an act of quiet abandonment. You are not the only one. Most people are sleepwalking through a life that mirrors the expectations of others more than their own truth. They decorate the cage. They polish the chains. But they never leave. Because to leave means you have to know who you are, without the mask. And that is terrifying. What if you're nothing? What if there's no one underneath? But here's the secret: the self isn't found. It is revealed. And revelation only comes through collapse, through undoing, through facing the unbearable possibility that you have never truly met yourself. The most dangerous illusion is not the one the world feeds you. It's the one you feed yourself. You convince yourself that your preferences are your own when they are inherited, that your ambitions are rooted in freedom when they are compensation, that your personality is stable when it is survival. The person who cannot see themselves is not simply unaware, they are invested in their unawareness. Because beneath the fog there is grief, and beneath the grief there is truth. And truth will burn everything that was built on the lie. It begins slowly, this internal unraveling. First as discomfort, then as crisis. You start to question why things that should make you happy only make you feel emptier. You start to notice the disconnect between your outer life and your inner silence. You feel like an actor trapped in a role they've played for too long, repeating lines that no longer move you. You begin to see that your relationships are mirrors reflecting not who you are, but who you pretend to be. You find yourself drawn to solitude not for peace, but for clarity. Because in solitude, the mask begins to slip. This is when the shadow emerges. Jung described the shadow as the part of ourselves that we do not want to be, but which we are. It is made up of everything we exile: the rage, the envy, the lust, the fear, the need, the vulnerability, but also the brilliance, the passion, the desire, the wildness. When you do not see yourself, the shadow grows. It lives behind your habits, your passive aggression, your self-sabotage, your perfectionism. It is the self you tried to bury now, screaming through every misaligned choice. And here is the cruel paradox. What you reject within you doesn't vanish, it controls you from the dark. You start blaming others for the parts of you that you cannot admit exist. You project your shadow onto friends, lovers, strangers. You fear being seen, even as you crave connection. You punish those who get too close. You chase people who reinforce your blindness and push away those who threaten to reveal you. You build relationships that protect the illusion, not the self. In truth, the person who cannot see themselves is terrified of being seen. Because to be seen is to be vulnerable. And vulnerability threatens the whole system you've constructed around control. But what is control without clarity? What is success without authenticity? What is love if it never touches your core? Adler taught that every human behavior points to a desire for significance. But if that desire is not rooted in self-awareness, it becomes a mask for insecurity. You achieve to feel worthy. You serve to be needed. You perform to feel real. But the deeper you go into these roles, the further you drift from your essence, until one day you realize you have become a stranger to your own soul. That is the silent tragedy of self-blindness. You live among others, but feel alone. You speak, but feel unheard. You are touched, but feel unseen. Because no matter how much the world mirrors back, admiration, success, approval, it never reaches the place you've hidden. Because even the brightest light cannot reach what you will not expose. And yet, there is a fracture in the mask. A crack through which light enters. A moment may be brief when you cannot pretend anymore. When the old patterns fail. When the roles collapse. When someone looks at you not with admiration, but with depth, and it unsettles you. Because you feel seen, and it terrifies you. That moment is the beginning of awakening. Not the joyful kind, but the kind that hurts. The kind that shows you everything you've denied. You begin to feel things you buried long ago. Anger, grief, longing, guilt, shame, but also desire, curiosity, aliveness. And with them comes the terrifying realization that you no longer want to return to the life you were living. Because once you begin to see yourself, you cannot unsee. You cannot go back into the cage of false identity and pretend it is freedom. But clarity comes at a cost. You lose people. You lose comfort. You lose your place in systems that demanded your blindness. And in that loss, you begin to find your truth. A truth that doesn't perform, doesn't compete, doesn't conform. It simply is. This is the path of integration. The slow, quiet work of returning to yourself. Not all at once, but piece by piece. Not by invention, but by remembrance. You do not become someone new. You strip away what was never you to begin with. And when you look in the mirror, not the literal one, but the inner one, you begin to recognize something. The sadness in your eyes is softer now. The anger has a voice. The joy, though fragile, is real. You are not whole yet, but you are real. And that is the beginning of sight. The path back to yourself is not paved with answers. It's littered with illusions you once mistook for truth. You start to realize that most of your identity was shaped in response to rejection, not in pursuit of your essence. You didn't become who you are by asking what was real. You became who you are by asking what is acceptable, what is safe, what will keep me from being left. The person who cannot see themselves is the one who shaped their being through the eyes of others and never returned to look with their own. So much of your suffering comes not from what happened to you, but from the silent contracts you made in response. If I never need too much, I won't be a burden. If I'm always strong, I won't be abandoned. If I perform well enough, I will finally be enough. These are not conscious thoughts. They are emotional survival codes buried deep beneath awareness, yet driving your every decision. You become excellent at adapting, at pleasing, at succeeding, but you become estranged from your inner life. You forget what joy feels like without achievement, what love feels like without fear, what rest feels like without guilt. Eventually, the body remembers what the mind refuses to. You feel it in your fatigue, your restlessness, your inability to feel at home anywhere, even within your own skin. Your reflection becomes unfamiliar. Not because your features changed, but because your essence has been waiting in exile, watching you become a master of self-denial. This is not a flaw. It's a wound, and it can only be healed by turning inward, not to fix yourself, but to witness yourself. Most people mistake introspection for clarity. They think that analyzing their thoughts, their past, their traumas will lead to self-understanding. But thinking is not seeing. You cannot think your way into yourself. You have to feel your way in. You have to sit with the discomfort. Let the grief rise. Let the rage speak. Let the tears come. You have to let go of the desire to solve yourself and begin the slow work of meeting yourself. Moment by moment, pattern by pattern, memory by memory. This is where philosophy meets psychology, not in theories, but in practice. Schopenhauer believed that the will to live is the fundamental drive of human nature. But when that will is shaped by trauma, it becomes distorted. You don't live, you survive. You don't choose, you react. You don't feel, you manage. You build a life around control because that's the only way you've ever felt safe. But control is not safety. It is resistance. And what you resist within you grows more powerful in silence. To truly see yourself, you must be willing to sit in the aftermath of disillusionment. To let the ego burn. To let the mask crack. To let the truths you clung to collapse beneath you. Because only in the ruins of the false self can the real self emerge. Not as an idea, but as a felt sense, a grounded presence, a knowing that requires no justification, no validation, no applause. You begin to realize there is a difference between who you thought you were and who you are when no one is watching. The latter is quiet, not performative. It doesn't need to be loud because it isn't trying to convince anyone. It just is. And once you touch that part of you, raw, unguarded, unfiltered, you cannot go back. You cannot pretend the mask fits. You cannot pretend the applause fills you. You cannot pretend that being admired is the same as being seen. You will begin to mourn not just the time you lost, but the self you abandoned to be loved. The moments you said yes when you meant no. The times you stayed silent to be accepted. The way you diminished your light because someone else couldn't hold it. And that mourning is necessary. It is not weakness. It is honesty. And honesty is the only thing that begins to melt the blindness. But this seeing is not just about pain. It's also about rediscovery. You begin to remember things, old desires, lost curiosities, forgotten dreams. You begin to reclaim your voice, your pace, your presence. You find joy in small things again. You laugh not to perform, but because something inside you feels light. You connect not because you need validation, but because you finally have something real to share. And perhaps most quietly of all, you begin to forgive. Not just those who hurt you, but yourself. For not knowing better, for going numb, For staying too long? For leaving yourself behind? Forgiveness is not approval. It's a release, a way to stop identifying with your wound and start walking toward your wholeness. The person who cannot see themselves is not lost forever. They are only sleeping, only surviving, waiting for the moment when the pain of staying blind outweighs the fear of waking up. There comes a quiet moment after all the roles have been exhausted, after the applause has faded, after the performance of being someone you're not has become too heavy, when the silence becomes undeniable. It doesn't scream, it doesn't demand, it just waits. And in that silence, you hear something you've avoided your entire life, your own voice, not the voice shaped by who others needed you to be, but the voice beneath all the noise. The voice you left behind when you chose survival over self. You begin to realize the tragedy was never that you were lost. The tragedy was that you were never taught how to be found. No one taught you how to look inward with compassion. No one taught you that the feelings you buried were not shameful, but sacred. No one told you that wholeness was not something you earned, but something you returned to once you stopped lying to yourself. The person who cannot see themselves isn't evil or broken or doomed. They are simply afraid. Afraid that if they let go of the identity they built, there will be nothing left. But that fear is a lie born from a lifetime of self-abandonment. Beneath the mask, there is not emptiness. There is truth, depth, power, not the kind that dominates, but the kind that anchors, the kind that moves silently like a river beneath still ice, unseen but undeniable. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote, "No one can build you the bridge on which you, and only you, must cross the river of life." This is that bridge. This is the crossing. It is not paved with certainty. It is built with presence, with humility, with the courage to stop pretending and start listening. You begin to understand that seeing yourself doesn't mean you like everything you find. It means you stop turning away. You stop editing your truth to fit someone else's comfort. You stop filtering your pain for the sake of being palatable. There is a cost to this path. You lose relationships that were built on your invisibility. You lose approval that came from your compliance. You lose the comfort of old narratives that kept you small. But what you gain is not just a clearer self, it's a truer life. You begin to experience love that doesn't require performance, success that doesn't require self-sacrifice, peace that doesn't come at the cost of your voice. You stop asking others who you are. You stop chasing mirrors. Because you are no longer looking to be reflected, you are learning to be revealed. And this revelation is not a final destination. It is an ongoing return. Every day you are invited to meet yourself again. In your reactions, in your longings, in your silence. Some days you will forget. Some days the old patterns will whisper that it's safer to go blind again. But now you know better. You've tasted what it means to be real. You've seen the difference between being seen and being watched. And you begin to walk differently. Not faster, not louder, but with depth, with presence, with an awareness that your life is no longer a performance. It's a practice of honesty, of integration, of showing up in your wholeness even when it's inconvenient, even when it costs you comfort, even when it breaks the mold others tried to pour you into. This is what it means to see yourself. Not through the lens of perfection, but through the lens of truth. To hold your contradictions without shame. To let your past inform you without imprisoning you. To walk through your own darkness, not as a victim, not as a hero, but as a witness. Because when you can finally see yourself clearly and compassionately, the world begins to shift, not because it changes, but because you are no longer looking at it through the lens of your own erasure. You are no longer reacting from the wound. You are responding from the self. And that self, real, flawed, honest whole, is what you are always searching for in others. The person who cannot see themselves lives in all of us. But so does the one who is ready to wake up, the one who is willing to feel, to face, to forgive, to return. That one is waiting, not out there, but here, in this moment, in this breath, in this choice, to stop running, to turn inward, and finally to see. Possessed by an archetype. There is something inside you that you do not recognize. It speaks in your voice. It walks with your feet. It shapes your choices before you can question them. And yet, it is not you. You feel it when you walk into a room and become someone you didn't plan to be. You feel it when you fall into patterns that feel rehearsed but unchosen. A strange inner familiarity, not with who you are, but with who you've become when no one's watching, and you no longer resist. Jung called it being possessed by an archetype, not metaphorically, literally. As if a timeless pattern of behavior, a character older than language enters you and begins to live your life in your place. Not as a guest, but as a ruler. Most people never notice it. They confuse it with personality, with trauma, with instinct. But there's a difference between your story and your soul. A difference between the mask you adapted to survive and the self you abandoned to wear it. Archetypes are not just symbols in myths or roles in fairy tales. They are forces alive in the unconscious that seize control when the ego weakens. And what weakens the ego faster than shame, than failure, than love lost, or a childhood denied. In those moments of collapse, something deeper steps forward to restore order. But it's not your true self. It's a pattern, a psychic mold that's filled by your pain. Think about the woman who becomes the martyr in every relationship, the man who turns into a tyrant as soon as he gains control. The person who becomes the eternal child, helpless dependent, always waiting to be saved. These are not quirks. These are roles, ancient psychic roles. And once they are triggered, they don't ask permission. You don't decide to be overtaken by them. You become them. Jung said, the more the unconscious is split off, the more it assumes a threatening and autonomous character. In other words, the more we suppress the unknown parts of ourselves, the more power we give them to possess us. And it begins subtly. You start saying things you don't believe, feeling things that contradict your core values. You might call it a bad mood, a phase, a reaction to stress. But underneath, something archetypal has been activated. And it doesn't speak in words. It speaks in compulsions, repetitions, self-sabotage. That's how you know. You keep doing the same thing even when you know it hurts you. Even when you swear you'll stop. You're not choosing anymore. You're reenacting a myth, a tragedy, a survival instinct that belonged to someone else, maybe centuries ago. And your life becomes the stage for it to repeat. This is not some abstract theory. It's personal. You've felt it in your own silence, in your outbursts, in the way you crave chaos when things get too still. You are haunted not by ghosts, but by inherited forms, images that want to live through you. And they have many names. The mother, the hero, the rebel, the victim, the trickster, the seducer. But no matter their shape, they all have one thing in common. and they do not care about your happiness. They care about completion, about repetition, about restoring a psychological balance that you may not understand, but that your unconscious obeys without question. What makes this so dangerous is that it feels normal. In fact, it often feels empowering at first. You feel strong, focused, purposeful, like you've finally become someone. But that someone is often an overcorrection, a shell, an identity forged in reaction, not in truth. And then you wake up one day confused by your own life. How did I get here? Why do I keep attracting the same kind of people? Why do I always play the same role in every situation? These are the questions that haunt those who are possessed. Not by evil, but by meaning they haven't yet faced. Archetypal possession is what happens when we mistake survival strategies for selfhood. When we internalize a story so deeply from our family, our culture, our trauma, that we forget it was ever optional. And once an archetype seizes you, it rewrites your perception. You start seeing only what the archetype allows. The hero sees only enemies. The martyr sees only users. The orphan sees only abandonment. The lover sees only what can be adored or feared. Reality becomes filtered through the archetype's eyes, and you lose the ability to see things or yourself as they really are. But what's worse is that the archetype doesn't live in isolation. It summons its opposite. The victim conjures the abuser. The savior calls forth the helpless. The seducer draws the devourer. And so we attract again and again the perfect characters to complete the inner drama we are unconsciously staging. This is why you may feel fated to suffer the same kind of heartbreak, disappointment, or betrayal. You're not cursed, you're cast. Cast in a psychic drama that began long before you were born. And until it is made conscious, it will continue to run your life. If you've ever felt like a stranger in your own story, like you were watching yourself from a distance, unable to stop what you were becoming, then you know the taste of this possession. It's not theatrical. It's quiet, almost sacred. Because deep down, something inside you believes this role is necessary, that your identity depends on it, that to drop it would be to die. But that is the lie. The truth is, you were never meant to carry the whole myth, only to recognize it, and from that recognition, choose. Somewhere deep inside you, a myth is playing out. Not the kind with gods and monsters, but something quieter, more intimate. It unfolds in the way you love, the way you leave, the way you punish yourself for wanting too much or too little. It shows itself in the moments you feel most alive or most abandoned. We inherit more than blood. We inherit patterns, archetypes, invisible scripts passed down through generations. Jung called them primordial images, structures of the collective unconscious. They are not memories. They are blueprints, templates that shape how the psyche organizes experience. They are older than your name, yet they speak through your behavior, your wounds, your fantasies. And unless you confront them, they will write your life for you in symbols you mistake for fate. When we are children, we don't question these patterns. We absorb them like sunlight. We learn what to fear, how to earn love, what power looks like, not from logic, but from watching the emotional architecture of our caretakers. The mother who sacrifices everything. The father who vanishes behind control. The sibling who competes for space, for silence, for attention. These figures become more than memories. They become archetypal imprints. You grow up believing you are just that way, but in truth, you are echoing a myth you didn't choose. A myth designed not for joy, but for survival. The tragedy is not that we carry these myths. The tragedy is that we don't recognize when they become prisons. A man spends his life trying to save every woman he meets, not out of love, but out of an unconscious need to redeem his mother's suffering. A woman becomes the eternal caretaker, not because she wants to, but because she's terrified that her worth vanishes when her hands are empty. And these roles reward us temporarily. We gain admiration, purpose, control, but we lose something deeper, something sacred. The right to evolve, the right to ask, is this even me? Possession by an archetype begins when the psyche loses its center, when the ego, unable to hold the complexity of life, collapses into an image more stable than the self. And archetypes are stable because they are eternal. They don't grow, they don't change, they simply repeat. Which is why it's so easy to hide inside them. They offer identity without introspection, certainty without complexity. I am the healer. I am the fighter. I am the abandoned one. It gives you a lens, but it takes your sight. Nietzsche warned us of this temptation when he wrote, "Be careful when you fight the monsters, lest you become one." The archetype does not care what side you're on. It only cares that the drama continues. You can be the victim or the villain, the hero or the betrayer. Either way, the story survives and you disappear. This is why self-awareness is so rare. Not because people are incapable of it, but because the archetype doesn't want to be seen. It survives through unconsciousness, through identification, through the belief that this is just who I am. And when we challenge that, when we begin to ask deeper questions, the archetype fights back. Have you ever tried to change a pattern in your life and felt an internal resistance so strong it bordered on terror? That wasn't weakness. That was the archetype defending its territory. The ego, fragile and unsure, wants transformation. But the archetype wants preservation. It wants repetition, completion, reenactment. So you may find yourself unconsciously sabotaging progress, rejecting what you claim to desire, clinging to pain because it's familiar. This is not failure. This is psychic possession. To begin freeing yourself, you must develop what Jung called symbolic thinking. This means learning to see your experiences not just as personal events, but as expressions of larger psychological truths. That argument you had, it wasn't just about who left the dishes. It was about power worth abandonment recognition. The shadow of the orphan. The rage of the rejected king. The ache of the silenced lover. When you begin to see symbolically, you stop blaming others for the story, and you start noticing the roles being played, including your own. And you must ask, when did this role begin? Who taught me this? Whose pain am I carrying? Whose story am I reenacting every time I sabotage intimacy, every time I collapse into silence, every time I perform strength instead of vulnerability? These are not surface-level questions. They dig into the unconscious. They shatter the illusion of identity, because most of what we call the self is just a costume stitched together from past wounds, cultural scripts, and ancestral echoes. And underneath all of that is someone you've never fully met, someone real. But here's the hard truth, that real self cannot emerge until the archetype is confronted. And confrontation doesn't mean denial. It means recognition. It means saying, I see you. I see the mother who gave everything and now demands others sacrifice the same. I see the hero who must always win even at the cost of peace. I see the victim who secretly loves being helpless because at least then they cannot be blamed. These are not moral failures. They are psychological truths. And the moment you see them clearly without judgment, the spell begins to weaken. It's not easy. The archetype is seductive. It gives you a place in the world. It explains your suffering. It justifies your anger. But it also numbs your potential. You weren't born to play out someone else's myth. You were born to become conscious, to grow beyond the form you were cast in. That is the terrifying beauty of awakening, to realize that you are not the mask, but the awareness behind it. There's a strange safety in being possessed. It organizes the chaos. It gives you a name when you feel nameless. When life collapses and your identity crumbles, the archetype steps forward and offers you a narrative, one that fits, one that explains the pain. You don't even realize you've slipped into it. It feels like a coping mechanism, a phase, a personality shift. But underneath, something deeper has happened. You've outsourced your being to an image. You are no longer becoming yourself, you are becoming predictable. And predictability is the soul's slow death. It's how the archetype keeps you loyal. It seduces you with structure, with identity, with recognition. You start to build your relationships around it. You bond with others through shared wounds instead of shared truths. You begin to fear who you'd be, without your pain, without your role, without the mask. So you keep it close. Not because you want to suffer, but because it feels like home. And home, even when it hurts, is hard to leave. Some people spend their whole lives in this possession and call it maturity. Call it personality. Call it wisdom. But it's not wisdom to never question your own reactions. It's not strength to repeat the same story over and over, just with different faces. You may look functional. You may even look successful. But something remains hollow. Your victories taste empty. Your joy feels distant. And when you're alone, a voice whispers beneath it all, "This isn't really me." Jung wrote, "The possession causes a person to become identical with the archetype." That's the horror. Not that you are influenced by the archetype, but that you mistake it for your essence. The woman who becomes only the nurturer and forgets she was once wild. The man who becomes only the warrior and forgets how to weep. The child who becomes only the scapegoat and forgets that innocence is not a flaw. These roles are not evil. They are ancient tools, but they were never meant to become your prison. There is one subtle way to know you are possessed. You stop asking questions. You cling to certainty. You fear ambiguity. And most of all, you avoid the unknown within you. The parts that don't make sense. The parts that contradict your image. Because to let those parts speak would mean risking everything the archetype gave you, the validation, the control, the illusion of coherence. And so you silence your complexity. You trade mystery for mythology. And in doing so, you betray your own becoming. This is why Jung's work on individuation is so dangerous, not because it teaches you how to be happy, but because it demands that you lose what you falsely claimed as self. Individuation is the process of deconstructing the masks we've fused with. It's not about becoming something new. It's about remembering something ancient inside you that was never allowed to emerge. And to begin this process, you must do something radical, step out of the role. Imagine walking off stage while the play continues behind you. You hear the familiar lines. You see the same characters repeat the same emotional dialogues. But for the first time, you are not one of them. You are watching. You are aware. And it is disorienting. It hurts. Because you'll start to see how much of your life wasn't lived, it was performed. You'll realize that some of your relationships were never real. They were just enmeshments of archetypes feeding on each other. The seducer doesn't just want to be loved, they want to control love through allure. The savior doesn't just want to help, they need others to remain broken to feel whole. The victim doesn't just suffer. They subconsciously seek betrayal to reinforce the story. This isn't cruelty. This is unconsciousness. But when you see it, when you really see it, you cannot go back. You cannot pretend your patterns are just misfortune. You must take responsibility for the script you've been reciting, even if you didn't write it. And this is where many turn back. The comfort of possession is easier than the responsibility of freedom. To be possessed means you are never truly at fault. You are simply playing your part. But to break free means you must take ownership of your projections, your choices, your consequences. And this kind of freedom is terrifying, because it has no map. The archetype had rules. The archetype had steps. But the real self, the emerging unknown self, is not a repetition. It is a creation. Schopenhauer said a man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills. This is the tension. You may want to change, but what if the very you that wants to change is still a role? Still a mask, still a ghost of some unmet ancestral pattern? Then who is left to choose? This is why awakening is not about becoming more. It's about becoming less possessed, less automatic, less fused with unconscious forces. And the only way to do that is to suffer the loneliness of stepping away from the familiar myth. This is the cost of waking up the death of identity, but it's also the beginning of something sacred. Because once the archetype is named, it loses its grip. Once the unconscious becomes conscious, it no longer rules you. You begin to make space for something wild, soft, unformed, your real nature. Not perfect, not safe, but real. And this reality, though fragile, is the seed of liberation. There comes a moment not loud, not dramatic, when the performance collapses, when the role that once held you together begins to dissolve. And there you are, not in triumph, not in clarity, but in silence. A silence so thick it feels like the world has stopped breathing. This is what it feels like to confront the end of a possession. The end of a life lived on someone else's terms, through someone else's story. The moment the archetype no longer fits, but the self has not yet arrived. This in-between is the most dangerous place, because the temptation to run back into the myth is overwhelming. You'll crave the identity that once protected you, even if it wounded you. You'll long for the certainty that came with being the strong one, the wise one, the broken one. Anything but this unbearable openness. But if you can stay, if you can resist the urge to reattach, something sacred happens. The archetype begins to unravel, and something behind it, something older than image, more intimate than language, begins to stir. Jung believed that individuation was not a goal, but a spiral. You don't arrive at the self like a destination. You uncover it layer by layer through encounter collapse and reformation. And often the first sign that you are nearing something true is fear. Not the fear of danger, but the fear of being seen. Because the part of you that is real, the part that was buried beneath all the roles and myths, is raw. It does not know how to perform. It does not want to please. It simply is. And that is-ness is terrifying when you've spent a lifetime being what others needed you to be. This is the true reckoning, realizing how much of your suffering came not from being unloved, but from being unknown. Even to yourself. Realizing that the pain you blamed on others was often the price you paid to stay inside the archetype. To remain accepted. To avoid becoming unrecognizable to the people who only loved your mask. And now, to reclaim yourself, you must risk that loss. You must walk away from the false piece of possession and into the chaos of authenticity. And that chaos is not what you think. It's not about acting out or rejecting all structure. It's about meeting life without the script. About learning to choose not from fear, not from pattern, but from presence, from awareness, from a self that is no longer bound by myth. But to do this, you must become intimately familiar with your own shadow, with the parts of you the archetype refused to acknowledge. The rage beneath the caretaker, the grief beneath the warrior, the envy beneath the saint. These are not flaws. These are fragments, parts of you exiled by the archetype's narrow definition of acceptable. And only when you reclaim these pieces can you begin to feel whole. Not clean, not pure, but whole. And wholeness is what the archetype fears most, because wholeness doesn't need it anymore. The archetype survives through division, through exaggeration. It magnifies one quality and silences the rest. But the individuated self is a paradox, strong and soft, wild and wise, broken and divine. It cannot be cast. It cannot be possessed. It can only be lived. This is where freedom begins. Not with transcendence, but with descent into the real, into the messy, contradictory truth of who you are when no one is watching. It is here, in the depth of self-honesty, that the archetype loses its hold. Not because it disappears, but because it is seen, and what is seen cannot rule you. You can still feel the impulse to play the role. You may still slip into the old performance. But now you notice. Now you choose. And choice is the end of possession. But something must be said, something often left out of these transformations. When you leave the archetype behind, you lose more than illusion. You lose people. You lose approval. You lose the comfort of knowing who you are in every room. And sometimes, you even lose parts of yourself you loved because they were never truly yours. They were survival strategies. And survival is not the same as living. So what remains once the myth has burned down? Silence, uncertainty, and then possibility. The possibility of a self not built from trauma or myth, but from presence. The possibility of relationships based not on roles,